So, the fourth thing to think about is what exactly abuse and neglect is. And it's a difficult subject. It's not a pleasant subject, but also we sort of struggle for exact rules about what these things are. So in education we use government definitions, but we can define these things, but actually trying to work out is a particular thing, is a particular experience abuse, can be very difficult because these things change over time. So when I'm doing this lecture live to a group, I'll put very brief scenarios like this up on screen and just ask people to talk to a friend about whether or not they think these are abusive. And what we'll ordinarily find in a lecture theatre is that people will have different perspectives, they'll have different thoughts. So, an interesting one there, you hear a father calling his 5-year-old stupid. In my opinion, that's bad parenting. But if you go back to that definition about the impact on child's development, if that calling the 5-year-old stupid is repetitive and is starting to really influence that 5-year-old's self-image, then at that point, bad parenting is becoming abusive, you could argue. An interesting one to talk about as well, or an interesting two to talk about, are the 15-year-old girls, examples 2 and 3 there. So a 15-year-old girl's got a 19-year-old boyfriend, a 15-year-old girl has a 40-year-old boyfriend. Again, delivering this class live to students, I can actually see people physically repulsed by the 15-year-old with the 40-year-old boyfriend. And nobody would be surprised by that, but people are less repulsed by the idea of a 15-year-old with a 19-year-old boyfriend. And I will get people whispering to one another in class, and you can see exactly that they're saying, the 19-year-old people saying, yeah, I had a 15-year-old girlfriend, and 15-year-old, and people saying, when I was 15, I was going out with an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old. Now, in the eyes of the law, if that's a sexual relationship, they're both abusive. But the difference is society has less of a problem with the 19-year-old than it does with the 40-year-old. So what we find is, rather than having a list of these things are abuse, these things are not abuse, we rely on social construction. We rely on society to make decisions about whether or not something is a problem. So in different cultures, a 15-year-old girl with a 19-year-old boyfriend will very much be a problem. In some, it isn't. And that depends on a variety of different issues. So your own culture, your own education, your own childhood history. It's always quite frightening. Well, I say frightening, I'm making a judgment call there, but how many times do you hear someone from an older generation saying, well, I used to get smacked as a child and it never did me any harm, and that kind of thing. And that was normal societal decision making. That was how society viewed things in their day. Now things are very, very different. Now we have campaigns for banning smacking children. In England, Scotland, have been passing legislation to ban parents from smacking their own children. One of the things that I like to talk about with students is when teachers smacking children became outlawed in this country, and the answer to that is 1985. This is not a different age. This is not a time when there were dinosaurs and cavemen and the world was in black and white. 1985 was the year that Back to the Future was released. Didn't that, 1985, all 3 of the good Star Wars films were already out and available on video. We're not talking about dark ages here. But in 1985, people left the teaching profession because they could no longer smack children. They didn't know how they'd be able to maintain order and behaviour in a classroom. In 1985, people joined the teaching profession because, hallelujah, we're not expected to smack children anymore. It's society changed, and as I've been saying, society's views on issues change over time. So think back to the early 1900s, which you probably can't, but in the early 1900s, about 1908, was the first time that the police could enter a family home to intervene between a family domestic issue. Up until that point, it was considered to be a matter for the church, and then obviously things happened that made us think, right, okay, we need to take this a little bit more seriously and get police involvement. If you think back to the late 1800s in New York, the case of Mary Ellen, who was a young foster child who was observed pickpocketing and stealing by a couple of wealthy people who realised that she was obviously the victim of some kind of abuse. They could see from the bruises and cuts and her malnourished state. But children didn't have any rights in New York at that time. And we can't look at that as in the UK and go, well, that's New York, because our children didn't either. They were actually in front of us in bringing out legislation to give children rights. Actually, in America at that time, animals had more rights than children did, rights to protection from maltreatment. So it's when something happens in society, when there's a big news story, when there's an incident, that's when we sit back as a society and go, that's not right. We need to change this. We need to do something about this. So when I introduced our guidance documents in the first video snapshot and talked about working together to safeguard children as being the natural successor to Every Child Matters. Well, Every Child Matters came about because of the abuse and murder of Victoria Climbié. The investigation and the media reporting that followed her abuse and murder led to a revision of the Children Act, led to the Every Child Matters green paper, white paper, led to Every Child Matters as the guidance that we all followed for a long time, and as a lot of us still follow it now because it worked. But that case had to come into society's vision for these changes to happen. So because we all have different opinions, we all have different histories, we all have different education, we all come from different cultures, we all have a different viewpoint on this. That's why we rely on each other and the experiences of the people around you, and the experiences of the designated safeguarding lead as well. But if we were to look at actual categories of abuse, there are four: physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. I say it like that because neglect is the one that doesn't end in the word abuse. It's just neglect. And the reason, an easy way to remember them, is that the abuses, so physical, sexual, and emotional, are where something is done to a child, whereas neglect is where something is probably withheld from a child. So you have emotional abuse, but you can also have emotional neglect. But emotional abuse will be something done to a child, whereas emotional neglect will be something held from a child, withheld from a child. So just to look at the government definitions of these then. Physical abuse: a form of abuse which may involve hitting, shaking, throwing, poisoning, burning or scalding, drowning, suffocating or otherwise causing physical harm to a child. Physical harm may also be caused when a parent or carer fabricates the symptoms of or deliberately induces illness in a child. And that's a sort of current guidance or current definition. Now, I think what you can, I always, when I look at that as a definition, I can sort of picture the definition growing over time, where an extra comma, an extra and is added as society grapples with another incident where something's happened that we've taken a collective dislike to. And as of 2019, there are 4,170 children in England, and that's England only, have a child protection plan with this as their initial category of abuse. And what you tend to find with child protection plans is that there's an initial category, but there will be other categories as well. And often there'll be two or three, and often enough a child will be suffering from all four as well. Emotional abuse is the persistent emotional ill-treatment of a child such as to cause severe and persistent adverse effects on the child's development. So you can see that link back to the previous video. It may involve conveying to the child that they are worthless or unloved, inadequate or valued only insofar as they meet the needs of another person. So again, because it's abuse in terms of emotion, it's something done to the child, so it can range from constant rejection, denial of affection, through to continual severe criticism, deliberate humiliation, and other ways of verbally terrorizing. And it includes bullying, cyberbullying, and causing a child to frequently feel in danger. And this is where that idea of actually causing harm or causing a developmental issue with a child, this is where it starts to move from an off-the-cuff comment to something that is actually causing that child health issues or development issues. Now, what's staggering is that 18,460 children in England alone have a child protection policy with this as the initial category, which is scandalous. Sexual abuse. Obviously, I think when we think of child abuse, this tends to be the one of the four that people automatically think of. But this involves forcing or enticing a child or young person to take part in sexual activities, not necessarily involving a high level of violence, whether or not the child is aware of what is happening. The activities may involve physical contact, including assault by penetration, for example, rape or oral sex, or non-penetrative acts such as masturbation, kissing, rubbing, and touching outside of clothing. They may also include non-contact activities such as involving children in looking at or in the production of sexual images, watching sexual activities, encouraging children to behave in sexually inappropriate ways, or grooming a child in preparation for abuse. And again, like physical abuse, I can sort of picture how that definition is growing over time. Okay, and more examples are being added to it to make explicit that society has a problem with this. So, for instance, if we look at looking at sexual images, that'll be something that, in comparison with other offences, has happened quite recently in the timeline. What you need to bear in mind as well is that women can commit acts of sexual abuse. In fact, they have. So, famous case, Little Ted's Nursery. So, early years colleagues will no doubt be aware of Little Ted's Nursery and its closure following the discovery of a paedophile ring, where a female member of staff there was actually photographing sexual abuse of babies and toddlers and then sharing it with a paedophile ring. And other children can commit acts of sexual abuse as well. As of 2019, then, 2,230 children in England with a child protection plan with this as the initial category. And then finally, neglect. So as I said before, neglect is the one where, it's easy to think of it as something that's withheld rather than done to. So the definition for this is the persistent failure to meet a child's physical and or psychological needs, likely to result in the serious impairment in the child's health or development, such as failing to provide adequate food, shelter and clothing, or neglect of or unresponsiveness to a child's basic emotional needs. And again, this is significant numbers. 25,330 children with this as the initial category of abuse in their child protection plan. Now, there are different categories of neglect, and this is another example of where we will add, as time progresses, we will add extra categories of neglect. So you can think of things like educational neglect, which is a relatively recent addition. You can think of an interesting one in terms of societal construction is around prenatal neglect. So, the neglect of a developing fetus. Now, I've got two kids. I know from having a pregnant wife at different points in time that the actual official advice about what mothers can do in terms of drinking alcohol in particular fluctuates and changes. Some health professionals will say nothing at all. Okay, absolutely fine. Some will say you can have a glass of such and such every day, every week, every so often. And that changes from society to society, and it changes over time in each individual society. I'll tell you about when 45 years ago, when my mum was pregnant with me, or 45 and a half years ago, like many pregnant women, she had an iron deficiency. And the official advice, or the advice that she got from the maternity department at the hospital, was to eat pork pies and drink Guinness. Now, I'm not convinced that would be the same advice now, but it just goes to show that our opinions on these things, what makes us go, that's not quite right, it changes over time. So, medical neglect could be, at what point does not taking a child to see the dentist become medical neglect? Okay, there isn't a calendar where you leave it for so many days or weeks or months or years, but we have to rely on that sort of basic understanding of when it starts to have a health impact, when it starts to have a developmental impact on that child, then we need to start considering it to be a form of abuse, in this case medical neglect. Okay, but again, this requires you to have that relationship with your designated safeguarding lead and to be vigilant. And that's what we'll go on to talk about in the next talking head.